the organization of production. And we are leaders in the world in streamlining. If any of you have ever interested in the name Frederick Taylor at the turn of the century, the Taylor system of, he was the first person in capitalist history to study in detail every step of the production process to what's called rationalize it, to make sure that the minimum time was used in moving the screw from over here into the piece of metal over there, and to make sure that this is a way of organizing production that doesn't take into account anything about the person doing the work. The person becomes the adjunct to the production process, a cog. The person who captures this best is, of course, not an economist, a dull group of people anyway, but Charlie Chaplin. If you ever have a chance to see his famous movie called Modern Times, how many of you have ever seen this? Wonderful. So you know what I'm talking about. The scenes in there are the capture by a genius. So right away you know you're out of economics. A genius who understood what it means to be an adjunct. For those of you who've seen the film, you remember when the factory boss has a machine that's going to save time on lunch. And they strap Charlie in, and the machine comes and his little tray, remember that? And the little pusher pushes the food into the mouth, and then a little napkin thing comes and wipes his mouth, and there's a little glitch, and the repair guy is right there, and he happens to put two bolts, metallic bolts, up on the tray because he's paying attention to fix it. So along comes the thing, pushes the bolts, of course, in his mouth, and then cleans his mouth, and he has to choke himself. It's fantastic. It's a description of how efficiency in the factory dehumanizes the human being. That's America. That's why it was very important, right after Charlie did that film, to accuse him of being a communist and get him out of the country, which he left, went back to London and never came back to the United States. In any case, this history is remarkable. Capitalists were able to organize the production process so they got even more out of the worker than they paid him. Think of it like this. 2% increase, which is roughly what it was, year in and year out, in output. 1 to 1.25% increase in wages. So the capitalist gave the worker more, but got even more for himself. It was a good deal. It was the quintessential American deal. The American worker's standard of living rose 150 years. The capitalist got enough extra out of him that the capitalist was willing, he would have liked not to have to give it to him, but he was willing, under pressure, union pressure and all the rest of it, to pay workers more. Because this was a deal that worked beautifully. And for 150 years, it's absolutely remarkable. Okay, in the 1930s, a crisis happened. But in order to understand the crisis, I have to first tell you what happens in 1970. An amazing thing happens in America, central to the crisis we're now in. This line flattens out and tends slightly down. The other line keeps right on going. In other words, since the 1970s, American producers, employers, have been able to keep improving the technological system to get rising productivity. No end to that. The genius of American producers to increase productivity has not stopped. Particularly if you remember what happens in the 1970s, what this is, we could go with one word: the computer. The computer that replaces people with machines so that each remaining worker can do much more than he or she could do before. So it's the continuation of a productivity boom largely built around all the things a computer enables an individual to produce. So
were there also more people on the labor market after 1970? I mean, why
yeah, this is all per worker, so it abstracts from that. Yes, we're going to come to that. But the crucial thing, the thing that changes, the thing that I want you to grasp as central to understanding this crisis is this story. What the hell happened? And first of all, if I've gotten any of it across to you, think. If you have a population, a culture, a whole way of existing that has been premised on 150 years of rising wages, and you stop, that's a trauma for a population. What are they going to do? Their whole basis. What basis? The basis for the sense of achievement. Rising consumption. Enabled by rising wages. It's over. It stops. What are these people going to do? Well, it's real simple. They got two choices. They can kiss rising consumption goodbye. But if I've gotten across what I've told you, there's no way on earth they're going to do that. That's their self-definition. That's how they think they've made it in the world. They want to bequeath to their children that. They want to give their kids a good education, better than they got. All those things that are part of their sense of themselves as good people, as successful people, as good parents, as whatever image you want. They're just going to say, well, economy doesn't work, that's it, give it all up. No, nobody does that. Nobody does that. Did they do it? No, they didn't do it. Not a big surprise. What did they try to do? They tried to continue increasing consumption even though they had no wage way to do it. And they found the way. And they were pioneers in this, the way Americans have been pioneers before. Only this one doesn't have a happy ending. You know how we know that? Because that's the crisis. Here's what they did for the last 30 years. Two things. One, they did more labor. You know, if the real wage per hour doesn't go up anymore, one way to respond is to do more hours. Because you can't do the same number of hours because that's going nowhere, so you can do more hours. So the American household undertakes more hours. And here's how they do it. Daddy takes a second job if he only had one. Or a third job if he had two. But that's on the tip of the iceberg. The big thing, the women. Out. All that crap. The woman must take care of the children. Yeah, sure. The woman must be at home. Yeah, sure. It all disappears. You know, I don't mean to be facetious. It's a big struggle inside every woman as she has to cope with this radically changed definition of what her life is and what she ought to be doing. And it goes very quickly, which is why it has caused such difficulty for women. And for the men too, of course, because they have to adjust also to all these changed roles and positions. The women go out. They can now do more hours paid to bring in more money so the standard of living can be maintained and even raised a little bit. Teenagers are now, do a little work here, sweetie pie. You may only be 15, but babysit or something. And the old people, the retirement, come out of retirement, do something, a few hours, maybe a part-time, help. So the American family sends out its people to work more. That's one of the reasons that number I gave you, Americans work more hours than other people. That's a 30-year program to work more hours. It's not some mistake. It's not some peculiarity of our personality as a nation. That's an accommodation of a population to a traumatic event. And I'm going to explain to you as we go along why this happened. Right now I'm giving you the overview, so the explanations will make sense. The American family discovered this wasn't enough. Turns out that when mother leaves, when the woman leaves the household and takes a paid job, there are expenses. In America we have no public transportation, so the woman has to have a car. And she has to have outfits. She can't run around in that moo-moo. She can't do that. She has to have, an appropriate work outfit. And instead of making, a sandwich for herself at home, she has to spend money on the lunch and the travel and, the whole business. And it turns out she makes more money, but the family has more expenses. This kind of cancels out. So the American family does a second thing over the last 30 years to cope. You all know what that is. It borrows money. It borrows more money than any working class on the history of this planet ever borrowed before. Per person, per household, you name it, we're pioneers. Americans went crazy in borrowing. Never before in American history, and never anywhere else like this. 20 years, 30 years, from the mid-70s roughly, boom, we borrow. Americans borrow. First, of course, before borrowing, they begin to work down their savings. They had some savings. In the 1970s, Americans had savings. You know what? Today, Americans have no savings. We have a negative savings rate in the United States. We don't save anything. We spend our income. We used to save a poor. We don't save anything. So first, you don't save anything, and then you borrow. So Americans have now 30 years of no savings and rising debt. Average debt in the United States is now 140% of your annual income. When we went into the Great Depression, the average debt of the American family was 20% of its annual income. You notice anything? Debt. Fantastic debt. Well, for a while it worked. It worked. First, the debt was based on, I'm going to do this in detail later, but quickly for the overview. First, the debt was based on what? Well, if American workers are going to borrow their way into growing in consumption, because their wages will no longer go up, they will have the same problem we noticed before with the government. Who the hell is going to lend to them? American workers are not a good bunch to lend to. They don't have much. What do they have that a bank who lent to them could accept as a collateral, would make them not so risky? A house. So the first and still the greatest basis of all consumer debt is the house. The land and the building of the house. And the bank says, we'll lend you money, but if you don't pay it back, we're going to snatch your house because it's the only thing of value you have. Collateral is not interesting if it is, for example, underpants or shoes or toothbrushes. Banks seem not to want to accumulate large stocks of those. But a house, which they don't want either. You can see that now. But it's better than those things. So Americans' hunger for credit was so enormous. And the banks discovered early in the 70s